The US may be considered a country of immigrants, but with political leaders here and around the world using the immigration debate to stoke fear and win votes, how much of a global threat is the rise of right-wing white nationalism? Hello and welcome to Bigger Than Five with me, Ghida Fakhry. Anti-immigrant movements, both in the United States and Europe, are gaining increasing support. Here in the US, Donald Trump's promise of building a wall on the US-Mexico border has become a central part of his agenda, despite the fact that the number of those seeking to enter the US has dropped in recent years. New data also contradicts his claims that immigrants commit crimes at a greater rate than the rest of the population. So why has his message been met with such support? And what is the reality behind the rhetoric? We'll be discussing this with Janet Napolitano, who led the Department of Homeland Security under President Obama. But first, let's hear from Sheriff Tony Estrada, who spoke with us from Nogales in Arizona, where they already have a wall.
I've been in law enforcement for over 50 years. The longest serving law enforcement officer here, the only Hispanic sheriff in the whole state. And this is the worst, the least friendly border that we have ever had. And it's all unwarranted. It's not necessary. What the current administration and our current president is saying, that this is going to stop the flow of people and drugs, he is lying to the American public. The further you go from the border, the more these people have a tendency to believe that. Once they come here and they really experience the reality of the border, they said, all this rhetoric, it's not real. So the majority of the drugs are coming through the ports of entry, all the hard drugs and some of the marijuana. So that's not going to stop. The wall is not going to stop there. Now, it may stop or slow down illegal immigration, but I can assure you with this barbed wire, razor wire, whatever you have up there, and anything you throw at them, they will find a way. They will be creative. Now, right now, you've got people coming in, making false claims, providing false documents, overstaying their visa. They're not coming to the wall or the fence. They're flying in. They're coming in by sea. It's a combination of things. So for the president to say that this is the answer, this is the silver bullet for illegal immigration and drugs, he's misleading. He's lying to the people. And I wish he would come back to earth and really realize what's really happening, which is we have a safe community. We have a challenge. There's no question about it. We have a challenge with illegal immigration, but it is not a crisis and it is not a national emergency.
So then, does the Trump administration's plan for the southern border make sense? To discuss this, we're joined by Janet Napolitano. She was U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security from 2009 to 2013 and is a former governor of Arizona, a state that shares a 372-mile border with Mexico. Madam Secretary, we just heard Sheriff Estrada say the President of the United States is lying. He says there is no crisis, there is no national emergency. Who is telling the truth? Who has got it right? Donald Trump or the sheriff who's lived in Arizona and worked in law enforcement for 50 years?
Well, and I know Sheriff Estrada very well. He was sheriff in Nogales when I was the governor, and he's extraordinarily experienced at the border. And I think the sheriff has it right. It's not a crisis at the border. And to the extent there are issues at the border, a wall won't solve them.
So is the president lying, though? Is he misleading Congress when he says we need a wall and this is a national emergency situation?
I think he's misleading the American people about this. And, you know, I can point to statistics. I can point to the fact that under President Obama, we drove illegal immigration to 40-year lows. And it's basically stayed at that level since then. I can point to the fact that the majority of illegal drugs that enter our country come through the ports of entry. I can point to the fact that most people in the country illegally actually came legally to begin with and have overstayed their visas.
Well, let me pick up on the first statistic then that you mentioned, that during President Obama's term in 2010, illegal immigration, the number of people crossing into the United States illegally was at a 4 50-year low, as you say. This is according to the data from your own Department of Homeland Security. Why then did President Obama at the time send the national troops? Was there a crisis then that warranted this? Because many people would argue that this trend began under Obama, and in fact before Obama. You go back to 2006 under George W. Bush. In recent memory, every president, Republican and Democrat, during an election year has sent troops to the border.
Well, the National Guard provides, a different kind of service. They're not actively patrolling the border per se. They're doing paperwork in the background. They're doing surveillance from watchtowers and then calling the Border Patrol and saying, we saw somebody.
But I think that, I mean, you are militarizing the border by sending them over.
You and I may differ on what's called militarizing. The National Guard is providing, as I said, some backup responsibilities. I myself, when I was the governor of Arizona, deployed some National Guard to the border.
You were the first governor to do that in 2005. Was he wrong? Was the president wrong to declare a national emergency, in your opinion?
He is now, and the reason he's wrong now is because the border itself has evolved since that time. And the border itself is much more secure than it was at that time.
But your critics will say, Madam Secretary, that you were wrong too, that you were seeking re-election, and that's why you took this measure, that it was a politically driven move as well to win votes.
I would say that I took that move to make sure that the border between Mexico and Arizona was as secure as it could be at that time.
You mentioned a few moments ago that there's been continued progress in the last few years when it comes to illegal immigration. The numbers, you say, show that. Obama, though, was famously labeled the deporter-in-chief. In fact, he holds the record of the most deportations of immigrants of any president, 3 million deportations in his 8 years in office. Compare that to the total deportations during Bill Clinton's term, less than 900,000. That figure about 2 million under George W. Bush. Why did Obama deport more immigrants than anyone else?
Well, because as I was saying, because the size of the enforcement staff grew. It started to grow under President Bush. The money was appropriated by Congress, but it wasn't until President Obama took office that those additional agents were actually trained and in the field.
But surely
I would
what
also say
is
that
the crimes that these people had committed or hadn't.
One of the things we did with Immigration and Customs Enforcement was to institute priorities as to who should be deported, because there was a long queue of people who were in procedures, in process. And so we said, look, we need to focus on those who've committed other serious crimes when they've been in the United States, or repeated serious misdemeanors, or were national security threats, or identified gang members.
But that's not what happened.
Well, it is.
By the time
Obama left office, 90% of those who were being deported fell within those priorities.
But of these 90%, 60% had committed victimless crimes. In fact, ICE's own records that I have here show that 12% only had committed violent crimes. 52% were convicted, and 47.7% had no convictions. So we're not talking about people who had committed violent crimes, except for 12% of these 90%.
Right. And I would respond and say that by the time President Obama left office, 90% of those being deported fell within the priorities. Now, what's happened under President Trump is that they removed those priorities from ICE, so that anybody found in the country illegally was automatically put into deportation proceedings. That is, to me, not good enforcement policy.
The Trump administration last year faced a lot of criticism for a new so-called policy, a zero tolerance, to try to deter people from crossing the border, so separating families, essentially, families of immigrants. But some will say that, in fact, even this trend started under Obama. Although there was no separation policy as such, there was a detention policy going on for a little while under Obama.
I think it's important to understand the zero tolerance policy. So under President Obama, most immigration cases stayed within the civil side of the justice system. They were subject to administrative deportation. Under President Trump and then Attorney General Sessions, they changed that policy to say that anybody caught in the country illegally would be put into criminal proceedings. And that's what causes the separation between parents and children. And I would say that under President Obama, there were rare instances where children were separated from adults they were traveling with, usually because the adults they were traveling with were not family members. There were suspicions of human trafficking and other nefarious activity. But it wasn't a policy of the administration.
It wasn't a policy, but do you accept that under President Obama, a lot of these families were finding themselves in detention for many weeks, some of them for months, and that stopped when the courts stepped in and said this cannot go on, and that in fact President Trump is actually reaching into the playbook of his predecessor, trying to do the same thing, trying to get the courts to allow him to continue this unlimited detention?
Yeah, I would say
because
President Trump would
Obama.
be very surprised to hear that he was imitating President Obama.
But on this, do you think, is that what he's trying to do? Because that's what happened under Obama, wasn't it? That the court stepped in to stop this policy.
Under President Obama, there was detention, but families were kept together. And the court stepped in to say, well, you can do that, but you can only do it for so long. An entirely, to my mind, appropriate judicial ruling. Under the zero tolerance policy, where all of a sudden now you've got the criminal courts involved and assistant U.S. attorneys, criminal prosecutors involved, that results in really automatic separation from the get-go of families with children. And that was what was so wrong with it.
Secretary Napolitano, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
So has the Trump administration's so-called zero-tolerance policy discouraged immigrant families from coming into the United States? We went to the southern border in Arizona to find out whether fewer people are attempting the dangerous journey to the U.S.
When they reach this point, they're pretty much, their bodies are out of energy. They maybe lack water, food. Many people in the organization have encountered skeletal remains, human remains. It impacts your life. It makes you pretty passionate about getting out there and helping, doing what you can.
Bueno, vamos a ver, brincamos a Méndez. Emilio.
Entonces, no puedo regresar yo a Nicaragua porque significa cárcel. Nuestros nombres están en la Policía Nacional. Nos catalogan por pensar diferente como terrorista. Ellos nos dicen golpista y nos dicen imperialista. Porque ellos dicen que nosotros somos imperialistas porque es Estados Unidos quien quiere quitar el gobierno de Daniel Ortega, que es el régimen. Yo no vengo a pedir clemencia, yo no estoy pidiendo alimentación, sino protección. Que me regresen mi valor como persona. Por eso estamos hoy aquí.
Sí sabemos que sí he escuchado que nos van a separar, pero pues también se dicen muchas cosas también que pasan las familias completas, pues. Por eso decidimos arriesgarnos, pues, para que no nos conviene estar allá, porque estamos arriesgando la vida de mi hija y la mía también, y pues la de él también, porque él está amenazado, como quien dice él. Sí dicen que, unos dicen que lo separan, que primero pasan a la esposa y a los niños. Pues sí, que más quisiéramos nosotros pasar los tres juntos, ¿verdad? Porque pues somos una familia. Pero pues si dicen, no, pues pasa que primero pasa tu esposa y tu hija, pues no hay qué más decir.
Since we spoke with those families, the number of people seeking asylum on the southern border has reached a breaking point. That's according to the Department of Homeland Security. Now, with right-wing parties ascendant in Europe and hate crimes on the rise in the United States, will scenes like the one playing out on the southern border contribute to more violence against immigrants? We're joined by Ali Nourani, the Executive Director of the National Immigration Forum, and Jessie Jane Duff, a retired gunnery surgeon and Senior Fellow at the London Centre for Policy Research. Ali Nourani, how much are politicians like Donald Trump and others in Europe and elsewhere fanning the flames of the anti-immigrant hatred and in a way inciting violence toward them?
Well, I think when you look, whether it's in the U.S. or around the world, we think that people have three concerns when it comes to immigration: culture, security, the economy. And those concerns play out in really honest questions for people. Are culturally, are immigrants integrating or isolating? Are they threats or protectors? Are they giving or taking? Unfortunately, you have a number of politicians who are capitalizing on those concerns to incite fear and, in the worst case, hatred, and even worse than that, violence. So it is unfortunate. I think we need a different type of leadership from Republicans, which are there, as well as Democrats, to help people understand these changes.
Do you accept this, Jessie Duff, that some politicians with their discourse, their anti-immigrant discourse, are fueling this hostility toward those who are seen as outsiders?
No, I don't think that when you're talking about the facts on illegal immigration, let's be very clear here, we're not talking about immigrants. All of us are descendants of immigrants who are in this country. But when you're talking about illegal immigrants, we're talking about a lot of problems that have arisen from illegal immigration, from the cost for Americans to the cost of American lives.
But let's be honest, does it help when Trump vilifies, I think we could all agree, vilifies immigrants and talks about an invasion at the southern border?
It doesn't help. And I mean, the fact is that most of these folks who are coming from Central America at this point are asking for asylum. Now, I'm not saying that all of them should be able to attain asylum and refugee status here in the U.S., but according to law, they should be able to apply. What is happening here is that the administration is putting up blocks so that people cannot even make that application, and which then leads the Americans to believe that we are, quote, being invaded. The fact is that people are coming to our border, presenting themselves to Border Patrol to ask for protection. They should be able to go through a process and have that case fairly adjudicated.
Do you think it is a coincidence that during his first year in office, the United States saw 954 white supremacist attacks, and this is according to the Southern Poverty Law Center? Has Trump, in other words, stoked some of these anti-immigrant sentiments that we see by saying that he wants to deport Mexicans, that they are all rapists, by saying that he wants to ban Muslims?
Just got charged with racist action.
To you, does it help to
So I was on a conversation with leadership of the Anti-Defamation League yesterday, an organization that has followed these issues quite closely, works very closely with FBI to local law enforcement. And they were telling me that they have seen hate crimes against African Americans, the Jewish community, Latinos, and Muslims increase over the last 2 years. In fact, their fear is that hate crimes against Latinos and Muslims in the U.S. is actually underreported because there's a fear of the police. So when you talk to the Anti-Defamation League, they are particularly concerned about the rhetoric across the board.
They also say in their latest data that the right-wing extremism incidents and attacks that happened in 2018, or at least all of the extremist murders that happened during last year, had a right-wing extremism element to them.
Okay, so let me be very clear. We're talking about two different topics right now, and I think it's very unfair to try to blend with people who want stronger immigration reform with right-wing extremism. They're two separate topics completely. And for you to blend them convolutes the topic. We need to improve our immigration process. Most Americans agree with that. If you want to address right-wing extremism, I'm a surrogate of the president, and I do not go to rallies and ever see any of this. So what we're looking at is 266,000 illegal immigrants that were deported by ICE because of their criminal behavior in the last 2 fiscal years alone. Let's not ignore that.
Are we conflating the issues, Ali Nourani?
So I think I would agree with Jessie here that sometimes we have a tendency to kind of compare apples and oranges. I would argue very strongly that the president's rhetoric and other politicians' rhetoric is contributing to the uptick. But if we want to actually have a functioning immigration system, let's look at those apprehensions on the border. An apprehension, when you talk to Immigration and Customs Enforcement officials, an apprehension is somebody, whether they have crossed the border or they've turned themselves in to Border Patrol. So you know, we can say things are being conflated, we can say the data is being misrepresented. The basic point here is that we need a functioning immigration system.
It's not just about the illegal immigration aspect of this. All the data shows that acts of violence committed by white nationalists, white supremacists are on the rise in the United States and around the world. I mean, can we deny this? Many people would suggest that this is becoming a grave concern. Facebook just recently took a step to ban content supporting white nationalism, saying it is deeply linked to organized hate groups. So shouldn't politicians come out of their bubble and actually address this more seriously?
I think so, and you know, I'm going to give credit to an incredible amount of credit to President George Bush. I mean, President Bush is the days after 9/11. What did he do? He went to a mosque. He made sure that the message that he was communicating as a Republican from the White House was that Muslims are here as fellow Americans and as people of peace. And those terrorists who committed this awful act, they do not represent this religion. So I think that that is the kind of leadership that the country sorely needs from our president and from others, to be able to take this anger out of the debate and be able to help Americans understand that, you know what, Central Americans, they're fleeing a terrible situation. The least we can do is make sure their cases are being heard fairly.
Jesse, can influential leaders who have millions of followers online, like Donald Trump, absolve themselves of this responsibility to continue scapegoating immigrants when they know that their words really matter and have an impact on millions of people?
I disagree. I think that President Trump has done a very good job at expressing that illegal immigration is the threat. You disagree with me.
Again, we're not talking about illegal immigration. We're talking about immigration in general and how it is leading to a lot of hatred.
We are looking at a surge at our border, and to suggest that that is inflating racism or white nationalism, well, maybe if we solve the problem on the border and we start ensuring we have a fair legal process for people to come in, then we won't have the problem with the white nationalism that you feel is much worse than MS-13's threat or the sanctuary cities threat. I mean, I see two different criminal elements here going.
Your thoughts, Ali Noorani, do you see two different elements, or is it one trend and a certain rhetoric that's really tapping into this rising trend of anti-immigrant sentiment, xenophobia, call it what you might, but that is leading many to actually perpetrate acts of violence? Finally, we always talk about Islamic terrorism. Should we also start talking about white nationalist terrorism, just as The Economist suggested recently?
I think we should be talking about a country that is welcoming all immigrants if they go through a legal process. I think we should be talking about a country that is allowing people to go through a fair and orderly asylum process. I think we should be talking about a country that is making sure that nobody is forced to live in the shadows. I think that the president has the opportunity, and if not the responsibility, to be talking about a country like that and not tapping into and inciting the fears that people have. And I think that we're going to look back on this period of time and we're all going to ask ourselves, you know what, we could have been better.
Could we have been better? Just finally to you, Jesse.
I think we're doing great right now because we're addressing a serious issue, putting it on the forefront and making people talk about it, where before it was being buried. And I think that is important. And if President Trump is getting people to engage on this topic, that is a win for everyone.
Should he also be clearer then when an attack is perpetrated by a white nationalist, as was the case, and he was a self-described white nationalist, as was the case in New Zealand against people at a place of worship, whether it be Muslims or in a synagogue in Pittsburgh, as happened here in the United States last year? Should he be clearer? Should he condemn these acts, not just as horrible, evil acts? Should he condemn them as terrorist acts?
It sounds to me like you're never going to be satisfied
should
because
he know?
he
It's a very
denounced
specific question.
Yes,
he said they were evil
your
acts.
specific question is you want him to say language that you approve of. He
no, it's language
denounced
that he would
the
have
act.
used. It is language he would have used if it had been perpetrated by a Muslim, let's face it, or an immigrant.
If it was Islamic-based terrorism, that has been exactly what George Bush used to speak of George Bush. Also, when he was in that mosque, over his left shoulder was the director of care, which is tied to Hamas. So we have to be careful about assuming that everyone is on the right path with things. I think the president has denounced things multiple times. I don't think this was first of all, it was New Zealand. And to sit here and suggest that he influenced a man in New Zealand to cause this terrorist act is irresponsible by the media entirely. That'd be like me deciding to go out and murder people and go after Barack Obama and now blame him. That is just not even a logical...
I think today with the world of the internet, I think it becomes very easy for people across the world to influence each other. Your final thoughts, Ali Noorani?
I think, at this point, the fact is that we need, this is a complicated problem that needs a complicated solution. We need better rhetoric and better leadership from Congress, Republicans and Democrats, and the White House to call out nationalist terrorist incidents regardless of who perpetrates them, and we need Congress to actually update our immigration system. I mean, the fact is that the president is on the verge of taking away work authorization from 90,000 people who are legal immigrants. So there's a little bit of dissonance here where the president may talk about illegal immigration, but so many of his actions actually harm and undermine legal immigration.
Ali Noorani, Jesse Duff, thank you both very much.
Thank you.
So while overall migration to the US and Europe is slowing down, the flow of immigrants and refugees fleeing conflict in Central America and the Middle East is likely to continue. How far some politicians are willing to go to capitalize on this issue remains to be seen, but what is clear is that their discourse continues to divide and therefore weaken the very societies they claim to defend. From me, Ghida Fakhry, and all the team here in Washington, thanks for watching. See you next week.